honor for me to be here at this university and present on the topic of intermediality. And it's also very good to follow my esteemed colleague Christina, because at least on this occasion my approach will be somewhat different. I wouldn't focus on archetypes, I'd rather focus on what changes over time, and we move from culture to culture. As I will try to link the topic of intermediality also to internationality and maybe transnationality and maybe transgenre approach. But I allow myself not to have a full post-mortem, but start with a short personal story. I moved to film studies via being a freelance journalist and then film journalist, sort of working for a specific journal, and then only becoming lecturer when I moved to Britain. My sort of first assignment resulted from the fact that I started to write this sort of freelance work, and I can say I befriended an older gentleman who was a well-known Polish film journalist, and he somehow liked me. As at the time, people often liked me, and he tried to help me with my career. And he introduced me to somebody who was quite influential then in Polish, we can say, film business, and is still very influential. His name was Roman Gutek, and he is currently the director of Wrocław Film Festival. And anyway, he was already in this sort of business of film festivals. This was in the early 90s, so he sort of brought me to Roman, and he asked if he has any work for me, and Roman said, yes, you can do some work for catalogs, but also we got money and we have to do a book on Peter Greenaway. And can you do a book on Peter Greenaway? And I said, yes. And he said, so it needs to be finished in 4 months. And then I said, yes, okay, I can do it in 4 months, and I did it, and it was published in 1992. And then after reading Agnes' work, I realized that this was actually my first work on intermediality, because it was not completely a monograph. It was a smallish book with some pieces written by other authors, but I did sort of maybe 60% of this book, so it's kind of strange hybrid, but what you can do in 4 months. And largely it's about relation between Greenaway's work and other media. And strangely enough, maybe 20 years after that, no, slightly less than that, somebody wrote to me from Granada University saying that, asking me if I can be her second supervisor on a PhD, a Polish person studying in Granada for a PhD program, and she's doing a work on Greenaway and Francis Bacon and their relation to painting. So this was my kind of second step into intermediality, still without realizing that this is what I was doing. And now the topic of my presentation today is the work of the Polish director Walerian Borowczyk. So this is actually much smaller subject than the sort of road through the history of Eastern European cinema, which Christina offered us so brilliantly, but it somehow links to some extent to what she was saying, namely my realization when I moved to Britain that everything what is written about Polish cinema is basically Wajda, and I cannot, dare to write another book about Wajda because I didn't know Wajda so well, and there are these sort of undiscovered directors. So I was thinking that, I will try to do a trilogy of directors who worked in the East and in the West, and namely Polański, Skolimowski, and Borowczyk. And I managed to do Polański, I managed to do Skolimowski, I never managed to do Borowczyk, and somehow this Borowczyk kept receding and receding for various reasons. One was that I discovered somebody who was actually such a brilliant expert on Borowczyk, Daniel Bird, that I thought, he really should do this book, and rather than me. He still didn't do it. So this is actually my only attempt to deal with Borowczyk. And again, this wasn't even something which came from my heart. It came from a particular assignment first to do with retrospective of Borowczyk's films organized by the British Film Institute. So I was asked to participate in a panel on Borowczyk. And this is in the context of somehow of rediscovering his work, at least in Eastern Europe, but to some extent in the West, as this retrospective shows. Obviously, BFI doesn't give its space to somebody completely unknown, and it's also related to releasing his films by in new versions, and also apparently maybe not such retrospective, but there was also a retrospective of his work in France, and it was on various occasions in Poland, including at the Museum of Modern Art some years ago, and several months ago I actually traveled to Bratislava for a different subject, but I learned that there will be a retrospective of Borowczyk's films also in Bratislava, and quite sort of large. I even received already a book on Borowczyk published in Slovak. So there is some kind of renaissance of Borowczyk's work. Mostly this renaissance is to do with the perception that he was an artist, a visual artist who used cinema, and in the context of his work being divided into two parts. This sort of artistic and this second one, which is pornographic, where sort of my approach is somewhat different, as this title suggests. I want to focus here on Borowczyk's work as pornography, arguing that there is really no big chasm between his work as an artist and his work as a pornographer. On the contrary, pornography somehow brought to the fore his, I would say, graphic artist's sensibility. But first I want to introduce him a bit, as I'm sure that not being Polish, you might not even know the name, not even less the work of this director. So he was born in 1993, died in 2006. Here is his photograph with the frame, which I think is quite symbolic for his approach to work. And he studied painting at the Academy of Arts in Krakow before moving to lithography, then designing posters, then making animated film, largely working with another Polish artist, Jan Lenica, was also known for designing posters, and finally films with actors. So we can see that in terms of trajectory, it's very much sort of moving from still to moving, and we can say from high art also to low art, if we still believe that film is somehow a lower art than fine arts. And this is very selected filmography. He made many films, but I chose these films partly because I see them as kind of important films in his career, but also even if you look already at the titles, you see here a certain, trajectory. So the first title is somehow has nothing to do with love, and the further we go, the more pornographic titles we get, and as you could see in 1987 he made Emmanuel 5, which somehow speaks for itself. So a typical narrative of Borowczyk's life is that of downgrowth mobility. He left Poland in 1959, and somehow this was regarded as certain, division of his life and career. So this trajectory will be seen as moving from being a surrealist artist to pornographer. So I will argue that this trajectory has also sort of, colonial or post-colonial inflection, because it can be seen as a male version of an Eastern woman who goes to the West in the hope of finding there a home and true love, only to be put in a brothel and exploited by her host. I mean, the male version will be more of a pimp, so it can also be seen as sort of, moving from being this artist to being a pimp. It's worth mentioning that in this respect, he's quite sort of, typical several artists from the East who traveled to the West. For example, Alexander Petrovich, the Yugoslav renowned filmmaker, his first assignment in the West was writing a script for Emmanuel. He did it under pseudonym, but it's not very different, trajectory than that. Polanski somehow is not associated with pornography, but his British films were produced by companies which specialized in sexploitation. Makaveyev had sort of, to some extent, a similar trajectory. So in his case, only the difference is that actually it afforded him a comfortable life, so it wasn't like a woman who completely ended impoverished. In his case, somehow this trajectory was successful to some extent. The nadir obviously was directing Emmanuel 5, the fifth installment of a history about one of the sexiest women in the world. And to demonstrate that he wasn't so bad by moving, this is his chateau he bought in France, and still his widow lives there. Again, slightly transgressing into anecdotes, but they're always nice when you are tired during conferences. I think he also very nicely fits certain type of a director. I managed to meet some of these directors or read about them, these sort of directors who were very interested in sort of erotic art, and they were completely monogamous, always married to one woman, and even claimed that never had sex with other women. Borowczyk claimed that this was the case. He was only married once, and he was completely monogamous. There was only one woman in his life, in all senses. Now think about Buñuel. I don't know how many women were in Buñuel's life in sort of biblical sense, but he was also married only once. And the same is about Makaveyev. Yeah, Makaveyev claimed that he was always faithful to his wife and still is. So this can be seen, this maybe interest in erotic art can be seen as kind of sort of, displacement strategy. And I will argue that there are the commonalities between these careers. So in contrast to most authors who write about Borowczyk, I see it that it wasn't really such a chasm. So he revealed the sensibility of a graphic artist, more interested in the materiality and touchability of objects than of a storyteller and of a rag picker collecting antiquities and curiosities, as described by Walter Benjamin. I think that if you look at the strategy of avant-garde art, it actually has a lot in common with pornography. In both types of films, somehow plot action doesn't matter, and the organization of film is spatial rather than temporal. Briefly about Borowczyk erotic philosophy. He wrote 2 books in Polish, and he sort of elaborated it in a rather convoluted way. The reading of these books is not too pleasant, partly also because they are devoted to his fighting with various sort of enemies. So it's inconsistent, because on the one hand, Borowczyk insisted on the importance of eroticism in human life and its positive influence on people, perhaps due Wilhelm Reich influence, the time when he was kind of moving to this type of works, late 60s, 70s. I think Reich was a very influential figure. The same is true about Makaveyev. They were also children of Reich to such an extent that even their claim was that children should have a right to explore their own sexuality. So if we find children pornography in these films or pedophilia, this will be largely to in the spirit give child freedom to explore their sexuality, and we find such motives in Makaveyev's work. So this is on the one hand. So he sort of says, eroticism is so pure, it gets the best of us. But at the same time, he disowned Emmanuel 5 and played down the erotic aspect of his films. He claimed that this is a film, for example, about a dream. It's not about the body. It's about unconscious, and this is a Freudian film. This is not a pornography. And he didn't like the term pornography at all. So presented himself as a universal artist close to surrealism, one who has imagination rather than erotic imagination and explores the logic of a dream. But it was very hostile to the term pornography, as it does not belong to the language of art, but to legal discourse and is used to punish and shame people. And now I want to just quickly look at his trajectory and the reasons why he left Poland. As I mentioned earlier, he left Poland in 59 or 58, and then he worked in France, largely in France and in Italy. And I think this can be linked to the situation, political situation and cultural situation in these countries. So I will argue that Poland was no country for pornographers, certainly after the Second World War, as most Eastern European countries. And I would say that in the 50s, when he started his work, there was this anti-erotic bias, at least in the ideologies of the main centers of power. So the communist state was against eroticism, regarding, sex as a tool of procreation, not as a source of pleasure. You just produce babies for socialism rather than frolic. The Catholic Church, I think, again, no need to emphasize it, was also very anti-sexual. And I would say Polish political opposition, including in cinemas, represented by such directors as Munch and Wajda. Maybe they weren't so much anti-sex, but certainly for them, sex was secondary. It was the patriot, it was the sort of, fighting for the truth about home army was much more important than exploring individualist instinct. And I would say that these three centers of power are frequently criticized by Borowczyk. So, for example, totalitarian state we find criticized in Goto. The church is condemned practically in every of his films, and also the political opposition, not directly in his films, but off screen. He's the director who really hates fellow Polish filmmakers such as Andrzej Wajda and Krzysztof Zanussi. Zanussi, the most Catholic Polish director, if you know anything about Polish cinema, really, can spend, pages and pages of his book, telling how bad Zanussi is and how he hates him. But what happened, he returned to Poland briefly in the early 70s, so it's not just a simple trajectory from the east to the west, but it's from the east to the west and back. And the question, and he made this film based on Stefan Żeromski's novel, The Story of Sin. And I asked myself why it happened, and I would say Poland was always a very good country to make films. You get plenty of money and freedom actually to make films in communist times, but particularly in the 70s was really, the first half of the 70s was really a perfect time for Borowczyk, so it's not surprisingly that he returned, because there was a liberalization of censorship, and moreover, eroticism was encouraged in cinema. This was seen as playing good functions in two types of art, we can say, namely conformist art and subversive art. So on the one hand, erotism was seen as a metaphor of a consumer society, somehow corruption of soul and its excesses. So this is the way it's seen by the sort of more ambitious authorist directors of this period, and the same will go for Eastern Europe at large, for example, Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia, slightly earlier period, but at the same it was also presented as a sort of circus meant to divert attention from politics. And this is how eroticism is presented in the films of this sort of, for example, filmmakers who make films about, 15th century or something like that, And it's also worth mentioning that by this point, Poland has a director who was at least as daring in representing the body and as Borowczyk, who worked in Poland, who later emigrated actually from Poland, named Andrzej Żuławski, who recently died. So he made this film based on Dzieje Grzechu, The Story of Sin, based on a popular novel by Stefan Żeromski, kind of Polish national writer who also made this novel, who can be read as pornographic. Actually read it for the sake of writing this piece, and it's kind of, like contemporary pornography almost. It's extremely daring despite being written a long time ago. So it's a story of a fallen woman, and it was screened twice before the Second World War. So you have just a still from that. So why he didn't stay in Poland? In the second half of the 90s, economic crisis befell Poland. Cinema also became dominated by the serious and morbid cinema of moral concern. And again, Poland stopped being a country suitable for pornographers. And now why he moved to France, why he left Poland for France in the first place? Well, first of all, France is seen as a country of love. Love is seen as a respectable subject for art in this country. Sexual liberation was an important motive in the liberation movements of the 60s, which culminated in May 68. This was an important topic in the New Wave and Roger Vadim's film and so on. So Borowczyk obviously could have felt more at home in the New Wave circle in France than among the directors belonging to the Polish school, let's say, Wajda, Munch, and so on. And he became friendly with the filmmakers belonging to the so-called left bang group, of whom the most famous were Chris Marker. And so he collaborated initially with Marker. However, we should also emphasize that there were differences, and this also explains why actually in the 70s he didn't stay in France but moved to Poland and then to Italy. So each of these famous directors somehow had different approach to sex. So for Godard, sex was a metaphor of capitalist exploitation. I don't think this was something which would suit Borowczyk. Romer, it was usually a topic of philosophical discussions. Marker had little interest in sex whatsoever, so And I would say that the breaking point was 68. And I don't know actually his history so well. Probably this will require making interviews with his collaborators, but this is my hypothesis, that probably this severed Borowczyk's links with the New Wave, because the politics of Godard and Marker then became very pronounced. They became Maoists, interested in the third world, breaking the barrier between the producer and consumer of art and this kind of things. I would say this was actually unacceptable for an immigrant from Eastern Europe. We couldn't somehow imagine somebody coming from Poland, maybe more from Yugoslavia, but certainly a Polish director wouldn't become a Maoist in France. It didn't flee from Poland to be a Maoist later on. So not being able to follow either the leading French or Polish directors, I will argue, nor having a penchant for a mainstream narrative cinemas, for example, Polanski had, he had little chance but to shoot pornography or sort of low genres in a wider sense, I would say. And this, in my opinion, explains why in the 70s most of his film became French-Italian co-productions, because at this time, the 70s, Italy became the capital of sexploitation, hence a natural place for the pornographer. And after that, I will actually want to read my piece, but first, let's show you some clips. This is a trailer to one of his films. Okay, so you got a glimpse of what Borowczyk was doing, and now I will read the part which is the main part of my presentation and which somehow hopefully links to Intermediality. And I gave it the title, Pornography Swan's Way. So definitions of pornography are contested, but they contain a common core. Firstly, as Susan Sontag notes, pornography occurs when we deal with the explicit portrayal of a sexual subject matter as opposed to the veiled and detached description and depictions which are the prerogatives of art. The explicitness is meant to lead to sexual arousal. For this reason, Linda Williams lists pornography along with melodrama and horror, as they are all low jerking genres, forcing the viewer to react bodily, weep, be frightened, or in the case with pornography, masturbate. Secondly, pornography is a strictly commercial activity. It is produced to sell quickly. For this reason, it is regarded as exploitative, most importantly of actresses whose bodies are displaced or even engaged in sexual sex, in hardcore pornography, for the delectation of male audience on whose low instincts the pornographers play. No wonder that pornography attracted much criticism from some feminists, such as Andrea Dworkin, known for her radicalism, who wrote, the word pornography, derived from the ancient Greek porne and graphos, means writing about whores. Porne means whore, specifically and exclusively the lowest class of whore, which in ancient Greece was the brothel slut available to all male citizens. The porne was the cheapest in the literal sense, least regarded, least protected of all women, including slaves. She was simply and clearly and absolutely a sexual slave. Graphos means writing, etching, or drawing. The word pornography does not mean writing about sex or depiction of the erotic. It means the graphic depiction of women as vile whores. In ancient Greece, not all prostitutes were considered vile, only the porneia. The word has not changed its meaning, and the genre is not misnamed. The only change in the meaning of the word is with respect to its second part, grapher. Now there are cameras, there is still photography, film, video. These descriptions point to the difference between pornography and erotic art, but also to the difficulty of marking a boundary between the two. Some descriptions or depictions of sex are explicit, yet are regarded as non-pornographic, as exemplified by the works of Henry Miller, such as Tropic of Cancer. Some high artists attempted to elucidate immediate bodily reactions from the audience. This was the case of Viennese actionism. Thirdly, profit is often seen as the main motives of producing some high art, and in any case, it is difficult to establish, especially in contemporary times, which art is produced for money and which for more sublime reasons. Finally, while there is no doubt that certain forms of pornography are a result of exploiting women, some actresses claim that they enjoy being naked, photographed by camera. Okay? Maybe just to skip something. It's not easy to classify Borowczyk according to the above criteria: artistic versus pornographic, exploitative versus liberating, commercial versus art house. In some ways, he is a plain pornographer because many of his films are centered on corporal pleasures, and their plots are simple. This is the case of Immoral Tales, for example, Lulu and Emmanuel 5. Several of his full-length films, such Immoral Tales and Immoral Women, are made of shorter films, as if he lacked material to fill a full-length feature film, which is also criticism directed to pornography, seen as narratively thin. Furthermore, Borowczyk's films tend to have fragmented episodic structures, and the transition between parts of his films are rough. Emmanuel 5 is the extreme case from this perspective, but this observation also pertains to several of his other films. The organizing structure is repetition, not progression. However, this is also a typical feature of the art avant-garde. Borowczyk's own proper avant-garde films are from this perspective similar to his pornographic films. The organization is spatial rather than temporal. They move from one item to in the collection to the next, rather than from what was before to what will be next. Borowczyk is preoccupied with worlds frozen in time, and by the same token decadent, be it Goto, Island of Love, the chateau where the action of Blanche is set, or the aristocratic mansion in The Beast. At the same time, something blocks the erotic pleasure of the viewers of Borowczyk films, or at least the target audience of pornography, namely men who want to see everything. To use the title of his film as a metaphor, we can only say that he shows us sex behind the convent walls. The sexual acts take place behind the curtain or other object blocking our access to vision, such as a piece of furniture. Sex is represented in this way behind the convent wall and love rites. Furthermore, sexual acts are often performed in darkness, in a church or a convent, or in dimly lit boudoir. So as in the two films previously mentioned, as well as in The Story of Sin and Borowczyk adaptation of Robert Louis Stevenson novella Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Such a depiction points to the fact that sexual acts constitute a taboo in the times and places presented by the director, and more importantly, they are forbidden in the sites of religious contemplation. Borowczyk breaks this taboo, but only partially, by making his characters engage in sex in churches and convents, but in a coy way. I also argue that Borowczyk's films belong not so much to pornography as meta-pornography, because what interests him is not really the naked female body, but its pictorial representation. In this respect, he reminds me of Swan from Proust's Remembrance of Things Past, who used to look at real people as incarnations of characters from art or mythology. For example, naming one of his servants working in the household of Marcel's parents, Giotto's Carite. Borowczyk shares with Swan this fascination with what endures and returns. His focus on the representation of nudity is conveyed by frequent images of people painting, photographing, or filming the bodies, as in The Beast, Lulu, Emmanuel 5, or in Margarita, constituting the first episode of Immoral Women. Maybe in the end I will also show you another clip to demonstrate it. Borowczyk's films are also populated by voyeurs, often using complex devices, such as specially devised holes in the wall or optical instruments to peep onto female bodies. Again, I wouldn't give examples, just believe me. To counteract this pleasure, there are also devices to block access to these bodies, as in Margarita, in which Raphael, commissioned to paint frescoes in a church, designed a complex system of scaffolding, including traps, to prevent people from peering onto his work. These devices point to the contradictory way cinema works, as discussed by, among others, this unfashionable Christian Metz, as it was mentioned earlier. It both allows us to see things and equally obstructs our access to full vision by such devices as framing or lighting. One also gets an impression that Borowczyk's men do not love and desire real women, but their images. This is excellently conveyed in Margarita, when Raphael, after making a portrait of the beautiful bakeress, caresses the canvas with her painted breasts as if it was real flesh. Such a confusion between the animate and inanimate pertains also to surrealism and romanticism, two movements to which Borowczyk as an avant-garde artist is connected. His male characters often want women to conform to specific images. In the story of Sin, Niepołomski shows Ewa images of lovemaking from the Kama Sutra, as if he wanted to transform this girl from a Polish gentry mansion into hot Oriental woman. Miss Osborne receives as a gift from her fiancé, Dr. Jekyll, a painting by Vermeer, woman in blue reading a letter. This painting, which in the narrative is described as an image of a pregnant woman, can be seen as an allusion to Jekyll's expectation of his future wife to be a traditional woman, reconciled with her role as a mother, and a woman waiting for her husband while he, in the disguise of Mr. Hyde, commits the most hideous sexual crimes. In The Beast, we see images of women who used to live in the mansion and of the beasts these women encountered, as if somebody wanted history to repeat itself, so that the women behave in the same way as their female ancestors. Okay. However, Borowczyk's women do not easily acquiesce to men's demand to fit a specific image, but fight over it. In this respect, the stories of Margarita and Miss Osborne are the most poignant. At first, when inspecting the painting by Raphael, Margarita questions the truthfulness of her body. Is my mouth like that? As if accepting the primacy of an image over her material existence. Later, however, she challenges the painter, claiming that my body is not like that. I have dark hair, and demanding that he corrects his painting to account for her true appearance. He refuses, saying that one has to lie to say the truth, which can be understood metaphorically as a need to ignore real women in art to convey some eternal truth about them. But Margarita does not accept such rhetoric. Her eventual murder of Raphael can be seen as taking revenge on the painter for not being faithful to her real self. Miss Osborne, against Dr. Jekyll's will, refuses the image of a domesticated woman, which her fiancé imposes on her by taking a bath in the same substance, which changes Dr. Jekyll into the wild, murderous, and uber-sexual Mr. Hyde. Consequently, she also becomes a vampire-like and sex-hungry figure. Okay. It is worth mentioning that there is specific trajectory in the way Borowczyk represents women. First, he focused on women as the victims of patriarchy. Such women were played by his wife, Ligia Branice. In his later films, which feature Marina Pierrot, women overpower men either by forcing them to comply to their sexual requirements or by killing them. Okay. From this perspective, Ewa Pobratyńska in his Polish film The Story of Sin is a transitional or perhaps figure, or perhaps she merges these two types of women. She begins her life as a typical girl from a good, impoverished Polish gentry house, virginal, modest, and unaware of the power of her body. However, after meeting a man who would become her first lover, Łukasz Niepołomski, she shows an intense appetite for sex and later is able to destroy men with her sexuality. However, she operates within the confines of patriarchy as she is subjugated and controlled by men, that it's her pimps and even Niepołomski. Okay, maybe this is not so important. Okay. Even when Borowczyk's women have ordinary sex with men, Borowczyk films it in a way that gives the impression that their sex is propped up by a certain object, such a helmet touched by the feet of Margarita and Raphael during their intercourse, and later with money, with which she caresses herself and her lover. Solipsistic sex, or sex mediated by an object, can be seen as a metaphor for pornography, which is a kind of ménage à trois, the voyeur being the third partner. Finally, Borowczyk often shows that an exchange of money takes place where women engage in sex, but this fact does not undermine their self-esteem or reduce their sexual pleasure. On the contrary, money gives the woman extra pleasure and empowers them in their relationship with men. It is rather the lack of money and being locked in a monogamous relation, as in Goto and Blanche, which cause his heroines unhappiness. And then I come to something like conclusion. Borowczyk is also a swan-style pornographer because he chooses for his films women of great beauty and perfect bodies, which seem to be untouched by the physical and moral decay that surrounds them. The only, even if partial, exception of this rule is the story of Sin, where Eva's body reflects her history. The discomfort of pregnancy, the pain of childbearing, and simply hard work. One wonders who made Borowczyk represent the Polish body differently to his foreign bodies. One possible answer is that he simply have known Poland better, and we tend to idealize what we do not know well. The realistic representation of the body in distress might also reflect his dislike of the actress playing Eva. Maybe again this is not so important. But owing to extensive quotations from Western art, tableau-like shots, and an emphasis on pictorial effects, Borowczyk can be considered under the rubric of intermediality. Agnes Petto maintains that this phenomenon in Eastern European cinema might suggest a desire of Eastern European directors to reconnect their cinema to Western high art and dissolve the boundary between cinema and pictorial art. However, she also argues that each form or intermediality is different and reveals local references. Petto's arguments certainly hold true to reference to Borowczyk. His affinity to intermediality can be regarded as a way to defend himself from the accusation of being a pornographer by pointing to his proficiency in the history of art. However, it can also be regarded as a way to criticize high art as a patriarchal tool, a means to immobilize and subjugate the female body to male desires. Thank you very much. Maybe that's it, as it's still, so we have half an hour for
exciting topic. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with the films of this director. However, I'm sure that you may have questions nevertheless regarding Eva's presentation, or regarding Eva's other works that you have perhaps.
Can you show us some more?
So this is fragment of Lulu.
Raphael, and the lyrics of Pratt. Oh, what would it make of all this page staring today?
It's impressionism that's giving artists thrust today.
It's my opinion that times are going to change.
Does it always take so long to put on a costume?
She's a good change artist. A woman has to be a virtuoso in her domain, and everyone should know his place. Otherwise, life would be of no value. Always just beggars. No!
No? Madam?
All right, I'm coming.
Superb. You surpass one's most flamboyant fantasies. A model for a picture to drive an artist to distraction.
Would you reveal a bit more of your left knee?
Like this?
Yes. A little more.
Like this?
Yes, that's perfect.
I fear you've no idea what you're doing.
I know very well what I'm doing. Believe me, I know just what I'm doing.
Yes, but we see
I think perhaps it's enough. You get the sort of idea that there is a lot of painting going on. People sort of discuss painting. So I sort of, wonder why it's like that. And I would say one reason is the sort of, respectability, which you describe as sort of intermediality. But I think also, as I'm a colonialist, post-colonialist, for better or for worse, you can also see as a sort of sign of somehow, self-colonization, of showing that, I belong to this sort of high art, which is particularly important for somebody who more or less, makes films for years, makes pornography. So I would say this is like a strategy of self-defense. But at the same time, as I mentioned, he also engages with this sort of question of a role of woman within the art. And if I sort of see him as to some extent progressive in the sense that there are these women who will say, I don't want to be like a heroine of, let's say, similar to Oval Portrait by Poe, who somehow, die on the altar of art. I don't want to be like that. I will fight back. I will kill you if necessary. And they kill. There are a lot of women who somehow kill their lovers in his films in his later career. Yeah.
Yes, I'd love to ask you about the distribution of these films. Who were the audience? Did they have success apart from Emmanuel, which we know?
Well, after Gotto, all his films were sold as pornography, and you could see from this sort of trailer. They were sort of made by, distributed by distributors, specializing in pornography, except from this Polish film, which was sort of distributed as an example of high art. So, up to recently, there will be now a new edition of his films restored and so on. It was kind of, bad copies, as you see from this YouTube. It's bad not because it's sort of on YouTube, not so much because it's on YouTube. They were really, low resolution copies, so now this work is going on to somehow, bring these films to their full glory, whatever the glory will be, and distribute it. So I would say now what happens, internationally is this attempt to reconstruct Borowczyk as a high art artist. But in my opinion, and this is my point, we cannot really do it without, recognizing the simple fact that he's a pornographer. That this maybe, also allows us to somehow, look at pornography, which is happening, by the way, anyway. It's a lot of, in academic discourse, a lot of is happening to somehow recognize pornography as a sort of legitimate genre. And I think perhaps this is also something which we should do in Eastern European cinema, look more at, eroticism and pornography in Eastern European cinema. Because it's existed and happened. Yeah.
I think that besides the high art references, it might be interesting that most of his sort of pornography films are period pieces. So the concept is the period pieces, or some, so the historical heritage context might be important. And this is which contrasts him like Makayev's films, and you compare Borowczyk's 70s films with, for example, Jancho's private scenes and public virtues.
Yes.
And a high Eastern European modernist authors.
Yes, I made this point that 70s was the period of sort of, eroticism in art. You can also bring Oshima here. So there were quite a lot of, Pasolini. This was a time when, authorist cinema and Godard, when authorist cinema and somehow, erotic cinema came together. On relation that there are period pieces, I would sort of, link this again to two issues. One thing is that, this will be like using art. This will be a strategy to add sort of respectability to the topic. It's somehow more acceptable if we see sort of, people having sex in a chateau rather than at the toilet in the airport.
High society.
Pardon?
So high art
yes.
combining with high society.
Yes, this is one explanation, and actually I write about it also in this paper. And the second explanation is more sort of authorist, namely the fact that, you know, he is really interested in sort of in decadence. He was at the beginning of his, you know, of his career, he's interested in what somehow stays, in what is old, yeah, which doesn't change. And actually this, his most acclaimed film, which he made outside Poland, Goto, Island of Love, is exactly about that. It's this sort of, you know, it's an island which is, it's not an adaptation of Peret's book, but Peret's, this French author, wrote this sort of study of concentration camp, and I think this is something like that. He's interested in sort of what happens if sort of concentration camp doesn't disappear but carries on. What will be the changes in the world which doesn't change? And I would say, you know, using again, his films are very much about it, about something which, you know, which lasts for a long time. And changes, but only slightly, of this sort of, you know, slow death, we can say, in decadent decorations.
Maybe on the well, it's not a tradition in Polish culture, pornography. You partly mentioned Gombrowicz pornography, which might be interesting because it was published in the year when Borowczyk left Poland, and was adapted into screen in the year of his death by Polski. So somehow it frames the whole story of Borowczyk.
Yes. I mean, I sort of.
And again, the evidence is high evident.
Obviously, you know, Gombrowicz pornography is not about pornography, but this somehow, you know, mentions, I think, you know, this sort of taboo about you know, sexuality in Polish culture. From this perspective, I would say also, you know, it's very interesting to compare Macavejew with Borowczyk, because Macavejew's, you know, high standing has largely to do with the fact that he sort of, you know, explored sexuality while Borowczyk didn't. And so you're right that there is this connection also there is another connection between Borowczyk and Gombrowicz, because precisely they hate the same things, yeah? I mean, they hate the Catholic Church, they hate this, you know, socialist ideology, but also they are very hostile to this sort of discourse of dissidence. They both find it sort of like as fake and somehow overlooking what is important about human life.
This is not so much a question, rather a comment about what I've said about the similarities between, for example, Janczó's work from the 70s and Borowczyk's work from the same decade, and also what you said about how to maybe we should really evaluate porn or pornography from the points of view of an author or the historical pieces or the high art references. We should look at, I think it's really useful to look at the distribution right now of these movies on DVDs and rather now on Blu-rays, because there are many Western European and American Blu-ray DVD distributors who don't look at these movies like we do in the academic sphere or the journalist type categories. They don't use those. They distribute Borowczyk's films next to hardcore sex films or sort of pornography, and they also distribute Janczó's work maybe in the same category as someone from, you know, an American or European sex film artist or director. So this might be these distribution lists might be good guidelines for us to, even for the academic sphere, to how to compare these author works and sex works from the different decades.
I completely agree with you, and as Agnes mentioned, I'm editing this journal, Studies in Eastern European Cinema. I will be delighted to devote one issue actually to Eastern European pornography. If any of you is interested to be a sort of, editor of such an issue, I will be happy to discuss it, because I think this is one there are, I would say, two advantages of that. One is that it's still undiscovered area in Eastern European cinema. So I would say, Jancho probably is not looked in Hungarian discourse as a producer of erotic art. This is not a dominant way of look. As I don't know, what is written in Hungarian, but I doubt it's the case. Or for Milos Forman, for this matter, somebody who arguably first time showed sort of naked breasts on screen in Eastern Europe. Still, this is somehow played down in discussion of Forman. So it's a lot to do from this respect. And this obviously will require looking at what you say, distribution and and positioning within various discourses. And in case of Borowczyk, this is sort of like this was till recently the dominant view. He was sold as pornography, so he was pornographer. He couldn't be an author. This will be the sort of the argument. You cannot be an author if you are a pornographer. Yeah? And if you are an author, then if you are a pornographer, you cannot be an author. If you are an author, you cannot be a pornographer. Or this something which sort of needs obviously unpacking and demonstrating that this is not the case.
And I think if we examine these links, there are many more stories, interesting stories about it in film history. You can find out, for example, we all know that Bergman's early movies were distributed in the U.S. by the main exploitation distributor. For example, Summer with Monica was cut to so there are these are
yes, I completely agree with you, and it will be a fascinating project to sort of to show it. And the second reason, this will make us marketable. I checked who is reading our articles. And we have this, everything is now based on hits. And we had this year an issue devoted to experimental cinema. And I was kind of puzzled. This one article got so many of these hits, and it was about Latvian cinema. And somehow I couldn't understand why suddenly, Latvian cinema became so popular. It's certainly there are only, maybe 4 people who write about Latvian cinema and read each other's work. And by this point, it's our most read article. Yeah. And I think it has like over 400 hits, reads. It means over 400 people paid to read it. And eventually it came to me, it's not really about because the film is Latvian, it's because the film has in its title sex tape snuff film. So there are people there who actually collect sort of information about snuff films, and probably for them reading about Latvian film with these qualities adds to their collection. So
they didn't reclaim their money, did they?
Yes.
I just want to say first something that Tom McGowan, I remember in an interview, said that, I was growing up in such a kind of, Puritan society in Canada, that when we wanted to see sex, we went to see a Bergman film. So this was his exposure. But I have something to ask you. After Solidarność and all these turbulences in Poland in the 80s, and after the slow death of cinema moral concern, there appeared between 85 and 88, I think, a few films which dealt openly with sex, and one of them was Sex Mission, very kind of popular film. At that point, actually, the communist governments in all these satellite countries to the Soviet Union, because they were afraid of perestroika, and they will lose power, etc., etc. So they kind of turned to sex, and actually they wanted to encourage sex in all walks of art, especially in film, as a kind of diversion from the real issues. So how does this actually, how would you intertwine this with the paradigm of sex that was rejected by the state? And this is my first question. And my second question is, because I write about horror as a way of critiquing reality. But like, using the tropes of horror cinema to critique post-communist reality. Is there some similarity between the way sex was used by Jancho Makavejev and Borowczyk?
Yes, in regards to the first film, I think sex fiction is a bit like sort of pornography by Borowczyk. It's not very much about sex. It's more about sort of relationship between gender and, between the genders. So it's not particularly, but there are not, it's a film which children can watch.
No,
but
there was another director who made like openly sexual film.
I mean, there was a lot of, but I think this way, I even wrote it, if any of you are interested, I wrote a book about masculinities in Polish, Czech and cinema, and then I sort of look at this sort of discourse of sex and it progressed, and I argue that in Polish cinema it started from the 70s. There will be more and more sex as the time passes, and I mean, in the 80s, the main sort of vehicles to present sex, and it somehow links to what you say, were actually not films, sort of like not pornography as such, but heritage films. So in Poland in the 80s, and you can say these directors actually consciously or not consciously followed Borowczyk, because we were filmed like, for example, Thais, which was set in ancient Rome. Yes, and this is all about sort of naked women when you watch it. Yes, and so on and so forth. So this was the case, and also there was a lot of sex in science fiction films. Yeah. So there were several films which were science fiction, and they had a lot of sex. And you could say this reflected, first of all, the urge to make commercial film. Polish cinema actually started neoliberalization or commercialization in the 70s. So it wasn't like, there was a communist films which was state supported and which was completely oblivious to the issue of audiences, till 89, and after 89 we have cinema which somehow tries to earn money. Actually, this process of, luring audience in Polish cinema started in the 70s. Maybe, Jancho also put naked people to somehow get a bit more viewers. Who knows? And this maybe also requires investigation, but certainly this will be the case with Polish cinema. So this will be the vehicle to do it, and these genres came together. Also, at the same time, we can say that this sex was used also as a way to criticize, in a political way. And I mentioned, for example, there's a lot of sex in cinema of moral concern, but there it will be somehow presented as a sort of testimony to the corruption of individual by the state. The film would somehow convey that the state thwarts you so much, yes, that you came to the point when you will sell your soul, yeah. And this is, for example, represented by a figure of a man who is not a pimp like in this film by Felix Falk. Forgot the title. Anyway, we have a figure of a man who actually goes to bed with women to get some sort of useful information from them, which he can use to progress his career. But sex will be then represented very negatively, and I think Borowczyk wouldn't force himself to make films of this kind, because first of all, they're actually not erotic. They present sex kind of in a way that you don't want to look at, and they also condemn sort of at least this form of sex, where Borowczyk overall idea, sex is always good, Wherever you do with whoever, in whatever circumstances, it will always liberate you and make you a better person. And I would say this perhaps shows that he was influenced by Reich, and this will link him to Machiavelli, because this will be Machiavelli's philosophy, and maybe also of some of these other directors of the 70s, maybe Bergman as well. I don't know. Bergman.
Yes, I haven't seen the films of Borowczyk, but I have seen Dario Argento movies, and to me they are like visually plot setting, diegesis, whatever, they are very similar, and I wonder if then can we speak about the European pornography style alternative or simultaneous with our house?
I mean, I can't really answer this question, but I actually don't know much about pornography outside Europe and actually outside the sort of authorist discourse. Certainly there will be difference between, British pornography and this sort of continental European pornography, because in Britain there will be, this sort of the equivalent will be like things like On the Buses, or The Confessions of, Window Cleaner. So they will be normally sort of set up in contemporary, times, and they wouldn't have these pretensions to high art. Yeah. As for American cinema, again, I don't know really much about American pornography, but I believe they will be, America doesn't have such a long cultural tradition, so I believe they will be more often than not, again, set in contemporary settings. And there will be, American cinema generally was slightly less puritanical than Eastern European cinema, so, this will affect sort of, pornographers had to be somehow more daring. And also the issue of genre was always in American cinema somehow, stronger than in Polish cinema or Eastern European cinema. Actually, in Eastern European cinema, we started to talk about genre really after communism collapsed. So the sort of concept of genre was somehow not ingrained in the minds of critics really maybe till the 90s, as I think it was the case. Yeah.
Well, are there scenes in these movies where we can see explicitly the female and male genitalia? Because
yes.
I think
Yes, we see. I mean, there is also part of this of this chapter which I didn't present because of the constraints of time. Actually, in some ways, he goes further than most pornographer because he is also very there are also images of zoophilia. Yeah. And sex between humans and animals, and one part actually of this paper was about the relation between animal and human. This is also something which we find in Makavejev, which links Borowczyk to Makavejev. Both directors are sort of fascinated by animals and animality in human and humanity of an animal, and so they have specific. So he was quite sort of daring later on, and I would say, people paid and demanded it from that. As also postscriptum to my story of Borowczyk, actually wrote it also in my book. I think that somebody made kind of veiled biography of Borowczyk. This director, his name is Bonello, French director, and he made this film, I think, called Pornographer, where Jean-Pierre Léaud plays maybe you watched it, somebody, and I think there are so many similarities between the biography of this director, including this sort of faithful wife, and him sort of musing on, how in the 60s he was somehow seen as a liberator. And then in his late age, he has to do this sort of last film because he's lacking money. So for me, it's kind of like a veiled biography of Borowczyk, and there are also scenes from a film which looks like Borowczyk's The Beast. So I'm sort of pretty sure that it was at least inspired by Borowczyk's life, and maybe his wife didn't want to make explicit biography of Borowczyk. Yeah. About Bonello's film, yes?
About how many films are supposed to be about pornography, but they are actually high art. So they are directed by, well, I don't know if you can call them auteurs, but at least they are credible directors, and they are supposed to be about pornography, but in the end you watch the films and there isn't pornography at all. Because unless you get this huge close-up of the genitalia and whatever goes with it, you can't really talk about those films as pornography. So they are supposed to be about directors who have this fixation, but in the end we don't see anything as spectators, so there is no sexual arousing whatsoever in the particular films.
I mean, this might depend also, this is also one problem with pornography, what arouses us.
I'm going to watch Borowczyk, closely now, because from what I saw that you presented, I didn't see it as pornography. Eroticism, yes, obviously. Explicit eroticism, yes, but not really pornography.
Yeah, that was my impression because in a nudity won't make a movie.
She didn't show us the real.
Okay, that's why I asked. Because
Well, I said in many ways these films follow the taboo. You know, sex is very often in sort of, behind the wall and so on. But also, you find, genitals, and you find this sort of, penises of a man who has also a tail, because he is sort of half a man, half a beast, and but I don't really, my intention is, I don't really like this discussion whether it's pornography or art, or whether it's European cinema or non-European cinema, or whether it's sort of, Polish film or non-Polish film, As long as there is something there which fits the bill, I would say I have no problem with calling it pornography or European cinema, whatever. So my sort of approach is kind of more inclusive rather than proving that it's high art. I'm okay with calling it pornography, and for me it doesn't exclude calling it high art. Yeah. So this will be my approach.
There's something also very interesting in what you said. You mentioned that his films can be considered meta-pornography, and I find this delicious because you also mentioned Metz, and I don't think Metz is out of touch with things, and I also believe that we can use all the authors they have written, because whatever they have written is immortal, and if we can find appropriate context for it, then we should use them. And Metz is a good example, because Metz talks about the apparatus, and for Metz it's, cinema as an activity, it's always between an interaction. It's an emotional, a sexual, pseudo-sexual interaction between a viewer and the film. And this is what you have. I mean, the women and everything, because you have men as well, are totally exposed. So this is the apparatus at its best. So this is not just about meta-pornography, this is also about medicine.
I would say also about meta-art, and in the end I sort of link, because I think Intermediality is also for me sort of reflection on art in these films, which Agnes, for example, analyzed so well. You can say that there is also reflection on art here. But actually what I wanted to say is that it happens at the same time. So when he talks about art, he also talks about, because art is also to a large extent about, about sex, about eroticism. So he somehow brings it together, in my opinion. He brings it in an interesting way also from the perspective of gender, because he tells something about sort of, women in this art, how in high art, how women tend to be represented, and also how it sort of, affected or might affect the behavior of real women. So it's sort of, his point is that certain way of representations affects people. People might want to behave, and these sort of plots are very often about it. That there is this picture, and woman is asked to behave according to this picture, and his women say, I don't want to do it. I want to be faithful to myself, whoever the self is. And I also like it kind of, as I said, from the perspective of feminism, kind of progressive. Yeah? That he gives the sort of women the right, yes, not to conform to a particular image, which can be seen as a metaphor of any dominant ideology.
We have to think that, from the Renaissance onward, art has been about naked bodies, especially female naked bodies. If you go to see a painting, which is an allegorical painting of some religious motive, they're bound to be naked.
Yes, but they're always naked. The nakedness changes. For example, in Renaissance, women could be, were fatter on these pictures. And one can imagine that thin women looked at these fat women on canvas, and they thought I really should eat more, and I cannot eat more because there is no food. Nowadays, it's the opposite, and again, you can say you look at these pictures, maybe not in high art, but in magazine, and you sort of agonize because you cannot lose weight. So this I obviously trivialize here certain things, but I think that this is what we can read from these films. They are about imposing certain social role, cultural role by art. and the possibility of resisting these norms.